All right. Hello, everyone. I think we're still waiting on a few folks, but I think we can go ahead and get started quickly. Before I turn it over to your amazing trainers at Housing First, I'm going to give just a little bit of a background about RISE and our history with Housing First. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Cassidy O'Keen, and I am the Associate Program Officer here at RISE. At this point, I have seen many of you, your names, faces many, many times before. And if you have been with us before, you have heard this intro, so bear with me. But for those of you who I have not had the opportunity to meet yet, welcome. We're so excited to have you here. So again, just a little bit of a history about our history at RISE and how we've started working with Housing First. So RISE was founded in 2017 as the only public-private partnership that was dedicated solely to funding and creating solutions to end the overdose crisis. As part of this work, one of our main strategies is to bring people together to convene for action and share best practices and come up with solutions to some common challenges. And that has really led us to our partnership with Housing First. We have partnered with Housing First, I think, 5 times now to offer a variety of trainings ranging from harm reduction to eviction prevention strategies. All of the trainings that we have offered so far have been in direct feedback from our grantees or community partners, including people with lived and living experience that have highlighted the needs for these specific trainings. So we really, again, really try to bring the best ideas from everyone doing the work and try our best to offer a training or engagement in which we can address some of those things. So today's session is no exception. We have had many conversations with some of our community partners that they are having challenges engaging folks, particularly BIPOC or other marginalized populations. And so we thought it would be a good opportunity to jump in with Housing First again and offer this 2-part series on assertive engagement. So if you are the first time here, we did have session 1 a couple of weeks ago. That session was recorded and is available on the RISE website. This session will also be recorded and made available on the RISE website at the end of the week. And all of those other 5 trainings that I just mentioned with Housing First are also available on the RISE website, along with all of the resources and some viewing guides, so you can watch it on your own. So I'll take a second and just drop the link to the RISE website in the chat here in just a moment. So find all those trainings, watch them, share them with your colleagues, and spread the word far and wide about all the trainings we have available. Before I hand it over to your trainers, just one more quick thing. Housekeeping is we will have a brief evaluation at the end of the course today. We appreciate so much you taking the time to fill that out, especially with any ideas or thoughts that you might have for other trainings. Again, anything that we offer is always in direct partnership with our grantees and community partners. So any ideas you have, please feel free to put them in the evaluation, or I'll also put my email in the chat and you can feel free to reach out to me directly at any time. That is it for me. I will step back and pass it to your trainers today. Thank you again all so much for being here. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Cassidy. Hello, folks. It's great to be back with you. I'll do our kind of quick intro and recap also, but I won't take too long because I know we're ready to get into it. My name is Ryan Villagran. I use they and them pronouns. I'm a training specialist with Housing First University, so I get to spend my whole day talking with communities across the country about Housing First work, serving folks who are tough to engage, using all of these key evidence-based strategies to do that. So I think that's where I'll leave it. If you have more questions about what Housing First is or like what we do specifically at Pathways to Housing PA, would love to engage with you and we can chat during today's training or send me a follow-up email. But I also would like to kick it over to my co-trainer today. So last time we spent a really good conversation around structural barriers to engagement with Khalil Martin, who's a therapist and former team leader here at Pathways. And today I have another person with me who's kind of currently doing that team leader role, currently doing the engagement with folks. And so let me kick it over to Hannah to introduce herself and say a bit about herself.
Hey y'all, yeah, my name is Hannah. My pronouns are she, her, and I've been with Pathways for almost 4 years now. I started as a service coordinator on our step down team. So working with folks who had been with Pathways for a while and kind of got to see the end result of all the work we do up front with engagement and ongoing maintaining relationships. And then I moved to a team that was doing that engagement work. I got to see that for the first time with folks with primary mental health. And now I'm leading our newest team at Pathways. So we're bringing on lots of new folks, getting them connected to the program, figuring out how to maintain those relationships when the availability of resources is changing. So I've had a lot of thoughts, and I love this topic because I always learn a lot from you all about your experiences. So we love this to be a really back and forth interactive training. But I hope you get some helpful tips today.
Awesome. Really quick housekeeping. We're just inviting folks to be present if you can. I see around 72 folks online right now, so it's a lot. And I think it could be easy to tune out. So tune in with us. I would love to kind of share knowledge and dialogue together. In that spirit, we're welcoming questions and comments throughout the training. Hannah and I would much rather kind of dive into what you're thinking about and what's challenging to you through the Q&A, through the chat, than just kind of talk into the void, which can sometimes happen. We're able to offer CE credit for folks today. So if you're a person who is a licensed social worker of some flavor, make sure you're staying for the whole time. Make sure you're participating in our discussions. And ASWB asks us to ask you to keep your camera on so we know you're there. Cassidy mentioned this, but the way that you can get that CE credit, or even if you don't need that CE credit, give us some critical feedback or glowing feedback, whatever kind of feedback, complete that course evaluation. So we'll drop a link at the end of the session today into the chat. It's a short Google form, and that'll be the way that we can kind of connect with you afterwards, and also how you can get your credit. We are going to take a short break during the training just to kind of like shake it out, drink some water, use the restroom, whatever we need to do. But we don't want to be prescriptive about when that happens. So we'll play it by ear. And then finally, some folks are kind of concerned during trainings that they want to know if they need to write everything down, or like, this is a really good slide, I don't want to lose this. And so just to kind of heads up that we are going to email all of these materials to you at the end of the training. So don't worry about like taking everything down word for word or anything like that. You'll get all the materials. Last note around housekeeping is a note about accommodations. So we ask for accommodation requests on the Zoom registration always. And so anytime we see a request we try and meet that request. In that spirit, we have closed captioning enabled. And so you can have that for yourself available by clicking the show captions button on your Zoom interface. And you'll see the auto transcript. We are going to also attempt to read aloud questions and comments from the chat. When it's a big group like this, sometimes a lot is happening. So we'll try and pull out some key things that we want to be responsive to. And so we'll read those things aloud if you're listening along verbally. We've also tried to provide some high contrast text and backgrounds. Hopefully that's helpful. And then if you have any other requests around your learning, around accommodations to join with us together today, please send us a private chat. And we'll see what we can do to help you meet those requests in an ongoing way. We did it. Into the content. Let's do it. Okay, here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about some of the processes that unfold and some specific barriers to engagement for folks. I know that you're kind of heavily immersed in the opioid epidemic and what that means for your folks, especially around housing, and other challenges. And so we want to hear from you about your specific barriers, and we'll talk to you about ours. We are going to kind of mention the historical and structural context of assertive engagement. Like, what is it? Where did it come from? It is a term that's being used, but not by too many people. And so I want us to kind of like outline that history. We'll spend some time defining assertive engagement and talk about what would it look like to have a successful engagement? Like, how do we know we're successfully engaging somebody, even if they're not that one person who's like totally working the program and graduating and all that stuff. I think we can still identify successful engagement through a number of other factors. We'll talk about some key tools and processes of engagement when we know it's happening, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. I will say I'm excited to bring in some of Hannah's cases that she's worked with over the years. And so we've tried to sprinkle in some actual cases throughout the training today to kind of highlight principles, and we have some more cases at the end if we have time to get to them. But hopefully that'll animate some of our discussion and tell you where we were thinking about, what we were thinking about when we brought these concepts to the table. Here's our learning objectives. By the end of the session today, we want you to be able to define the purpose and goals of engagement. We want you to be able to articulate the importance of centering client needs. And we want you to be able to name 3 common barriers to care and maybe 3 creative solutions to overcoming those barriers. I think you'll have to think critically because we don't have a slide on each one of these things, but I think that's the overall theme that we want to get across. Okay, let's jump in. First things first, let's talk about some specific barriers to engagement. Why are people hard to engage? What makes folks hard to engage? And, last session, we talked so extensively about structural barriers. We talked about the experience of stigma and the experience of racism, and the way that stigma and racism, we can understand those as forms of trauma, right? And so to the extent that we're identifying symptoms of trauma in folks, it may sort of be, we can contextualize it through that discussion, right? Through those structural barriers. That context is meant to help you understand potentially what led us here and to give us some heightened sensitivity to where the potential mistrust might be, right? And when we're talking with folks and where that disengagement may come from. So I want to kind of turn to you and get your typing fingers ready in the chat. The question on the screen: what circumstances or characteristics have led to the most difficulty engaging folks in your work? I would love to kind of know, and we saw some of this pop up last session, but didn't have time to really dive into individual specifics. But individuals, right? We talked so much last time about structural, but think of that one person who's hard to engage with. What makes it hard? What's that circumstance? What are the characteristics? And so I'll turn to the chat as you're starting to think of those things. Mistrust in the system. Yeah, overall, the system is not going to help me, and I don't trust that you have my best interest in mind, is sometimes the message that we're seeing with folks. Specific suspicion of providers, right? Maybe that's you. Maybe that's other providers prior to arriving in your care, and maybe that carries over. Distrust in the medical system, yeah. Houselessness and addiction. Would love to know more, Casey, about the ways that shows up. Why does that make folks difficult to engage from your perspective? Trust, shame, absolutely. David mentioning clients actively using substances and refusing services. Sure, yeah, that's almost 100% of our folks at some point in our engagement process. Absolutely. Shauna, this is a really great thing I think you bring up here, because we're not blaming this person, but simply the factors that bring them to where they are mean that they have no good way of keeping track of time. We're setting appointments with folks, right? You think about like the therapy context. Well, you've got a 1 p.m. appointment. It's going to last an hour. How do they know when 1 o'clock is? And how are they going to make sure that they arrive on time? Is a key barrier. Absolutely. Trauma. Perceived lack of shared experiences. Is the person sitting across from me going to know at all what I'm talking about? Right? Is their lived experience so far from mine that I don't even know if it's worth mentioning what I'm going through? Absolutely. Anger, hurt, trust, insurance barriers. Absolutely. There's that's the worst, right? When something's so stupid like that, right? We're meant to help people. And here we are trying to sort of navigate bureaucracy to help people get care. That can be so frustrating. Language barriers. What a good one. And I'll say from our perspective, we do have providers here in the case managers at Pathways that are identified as Spanish speaking, let's say, for example, people, and you get more pay if you can speak a second language here at Pathways. And so trying to mitigate that, but noting that that's a critical one for folks. People feeling judged. Yes. A client whose phone was broken, who keeps breaking our appointments. Absolutely. And they can't even call you to let you know that they're not going to be there, right? No means of transportation, survival needs taking priority, right? Even of their own goals, right? I've got these big goals for myself, but I got to survive in the meantime. I think that's a really relatable experience. All right, these are so good. Transportation, interpersonal violence in the home, yeah. Concerns of abandonment. Gender role expectations. Ooh, Amber, this one is so good. And this one doesn't usually come up when we talk about this training content, but I think you're tapping, Amber, into the idea of like what it means to be vulnerable and who is permitted to be vulnerable to receive help, right? So the quote that you put in your comment, men should be independent. I don't need your help. Yeah, absolutely. And especially if you have a person who is like male identified, and in our service system, the predominant helper is a woman, right? And so what does it mean to be a person with those gender role expectations and also have to receive help from a woman? That can feel like it challenges a person's worldview and sense of self. Absolutely. Okay, thank you so much for sharing some of these. I hope you'll continue to kind of keep these things in mind as we go today, and consider whether we're tapping into what you're thinking about and offering strategies that can be helpful. But I'll just add some additional things. People's personal experiences. You all touched on this a bit, right? Whether good experiences or bad experiences in care before. Their own preferences and values come up too. And I think that conversation around gender role expectations relates there, right? I think about psychological defenses too. If I accept this treatment, if I engage with you, does that mean it's real, right? Does that mean I'm actually sick or not well or not normal in some way, right? And so the acceptance of care has this whole kind of avalanching process about my own sense of self, right? Maybe even somebody's specific symptoms may get in the way. If you look at like DSM diagnoses around mental health stuff, a lack of insight is a key symptom of especially like schizophrenia type diagnoses. And then active substance use, which I think has come up already today. And I'm even thinking in more practical terms around active substance use. Can I even like communicate clearly with this person? Are our conversations like feeling linear or connected? Or is it taking a long time to kind of have these conversations back and forth because of the impact of substances? Of course, we know that substances also impair judgment, right? And so maybe I'm considering my needs and goals, but a decision I might make now while I'm under the influence may be different than one when I'm not under the influence, right? Different pressures there. So that's a big one. Let me see what other things I might say. Yeah. Oh, this is another one that I think ties back to our conversation from last time, but the demands of other systems that require us to do stuff or the participant to do stuff, right? So many programs have sort of like eligibility requirements and like, let's say you got to work this amount, you got to report all this, or like probation has so many requirements around like showing up and reporting and kind of indicating your whereabouts, and all that stuff gets in the way of the engagement that we're trying to do with folks, right? So let's look at the process of disengagement, some of the processes of disengagement. When we kind of look at tap into some of the research around when people engage versus when people don't engage, folks tend to report a desire to be independent. They want to be able to fend for themselves, to be able to manage their own lives. And that when they're disengaged, typically it has a lot to do with a poor therapeutic relationship, right? We haven't developed a good relationship to overcome some of that structural stuff that we've been talking about. That whole mistrust of the system, we can overcome that together on a one-to-one basis, but not if we haven't tapped into the therapeutic relationship, right? And so people who we're trying to engage, they can speak to that and have. And we see examples of that in qualitative research. Another thing that people talk about as being a process towards disengagement is when they feel a loss of control due to medication and the effects of those medication, right? I don't know how that's going to feel. I don't know about the side effects and how that impacts me as a person, as well as our sort of ongoing focus on medication, right? If we as a provider are saying this person seems to be dealing with symptoms of mental illness, I need to focus on getting them medicated. I think people receive that as a pressure, as a type of coercion, right? And so if our whole focus is on trying to get them to be medicated, that tends to result in this process of disengagement for folks. We did talk already about prior experiences in care and how that can disrupt this therapeutic relationship, right? We're already sort of faced with a barrier to developing therapeutic rapport because of the baggage that people kind of have. Sometimes we may even breach people's trust, right? And so this can look like saying, hey, I'm going to show up on X, Y, and Z corner, or the intersection of X and Y with some food and clothing for you at this time. But then something gets in the way of that. Maybe another client's needs get in the way and I don't show up on time. And that person left, right? They thought I was going to be there at that time and I didn't show up. I breached their trust and I disappointed them. And that can happen pretty regularly, especially because we're helpers at heart, right? We're wanting to reach out our hand, and sometimes we overpromise and overbook ourselves. And then another thing that can come up is when we need to exercise boundaries, and sometimes when we're exercising authority, right? And so boundaries can look like, my day is from 9 to 5, and I have to take care of myself also. And so I shut down my work phone at 5 or whatever, but that person needed help at 5:05, right? And so that's a really tough one to navigate. Do I want to kind of uphold this boundary? Is it more important for me to do that, or more important to kind of help this person and get them engaged? And so sometimes the exercising of our appropriate and inappropriate boundaries, or too rigid boundaries, can impact the engagement process. And then, yes, when we're kind of focused so much on our program rules and lean a little bit too much into the power dynamic that is inherent in this work, right? There is an inherent power dynamic between us and the participants that we serve. We hold the keys to so many resources that they need. And so when we're kind of leaning too much into that authority process, people don't want any piece of that, right? People don't want to be controlled, coerced, talked down to in that way. And so it's something we need to be mindful of. I see a comment from Nicholas in the chat. Life happens outside of 9 to 5 hours, 100%. And I think we need to be flexible as in a sort of agency structural way, right? And so that it's not all on the individual provider to be that, to bring that level of flexibility, but that our system of care is flexible. So no, Hannah can shut off her phone, but I'm ready because I'm on call after 5 p.m. and I'm ready to step in, right? So that it's not always on one person. Okay, these are some of the processes that we see in terms of disengagement. I want to kick it over to Hannah to talk a little bit, to kind of walk us through a really quick case study that demonstrates some of the kind of resistance and engagement difficulties that we've been talking about so far.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in here and talk about Carla, because a lot of the issues we had with engaging her started long before we met her, before she heard of Pathways. She initially became homeless after a home invasion. So she had this really intense trauma experience that made her distrustful of people in general. And then she also had experienced a lot of interpartner violence, abuse. And she also had some perception-based disabilities that just made the world harder for her to navigate and made her more vulnerable in general to violence. So all of those things were kind of in this going on with her before we met her. When we got referred to her, or when she got referred to Pathways, one of the first interactions we heard about from her was that she had kind of assaulted an outreach worker trying to defend herself. They kind of came up to her and she was surprised. So we started reaching out to her while she was incarcerated. And it took a really long time for us to build trust. It was kind of a process of having very short conversations, bringing her water. She would get really overwhelmed by paperwork. For people who are feeling mistrustful, signing all these forms is a lot. So we would kind of do one small thing at a time. Giving water, giving food, all those small things to show that, like, we really care about you as a person. Like, we want you to be well and not just as a signature on a piece of paper for us. Eventually, she moved into her apartment after a year and a half of kind of those small interactions, building trust. And she's been with Pathways since. This was in 2014. I can't do math, but that's a long time. And she has great relationships with her team. She comes to so many events. She's reconnected with her family. She got a dog to support her with some of her limitations. And she's kind of, when I met her and if somebody would have told me this story right away, I would have never believed it, just to the level of trust and support she gets from the team and from her interaction with Pathways. And all of those things that made her hard to engage happened before we even met her. So I thought this example fed really well into what y'all have been talking about these structural issues around people who are differently abled and people who are vulnerable. This is how they show up with the people we meet. And we have to kind of use our knowledge to fill in the gaps sometimes.
Yeah, I love that. And I also love that, we sometimes do get referrals where other systems have said, no, I'm sorry, this is not going to work. You're assaulting outreach workers. And it's like, that's the people that are referred to our program, right? Like the hardest to house sometimes. And so I think, yeah, Hannah, your comments around like, it just shows me that sort of like it's always possible, right? And tapping into that therapeutic relationship is going to make it possible, despite how difficult it seems like a person may be. And so I think the persistence piece shows up here as well.
Yes, definitely.
So Hannah's going to talk us through a little bit of the kind of backstory of assertive engagement. So I want to kind of come clean and say we had an assertive engagement training that we've been doing for a while, Hannah and I, and something always kind of gnawed at me, like what is that term? I keep hearing it used in like a housing first context, but like what is it? It's not an evidence-based practice on its own. And so what is it and where does it come from? And so we want to kind of like outline that for you. And I think elements of assertive engagement sort of come from the structures behind it. I think say a lot about how and why we should be engaging people. So I'll turn it over to you, Hannah.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you gave that history because I think it is helpful. I was thinking of saying that too. So assertive engagement is a protocol of assertive community treatment. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of that. Assertive community treatment kind of came about when there was a focus on deinstitutionalizing people with mental health issues, behavioral health issues. And these programs were kind of a new idea after seeing that the hospital just wasn't working for people. And there was ideas that people who are undischargeable, who were in the hospital for long periods of time, were possibly, quote, too sick for the hospital, which kind of flips our traditional ideas of treatment on its head. The idea that people who are experiencing stress in an unfamiliar environment, who don't have living skills or struggle with living in the world, the hospital is not going to help them. The hospital is not going to teach them skills for how to live in the real world. It's not going to give them a less stressful environment. It's going to add stress to their environment. So initially, these programs were called kind of training and community living programs. The idea of giving people skills, putting people in the environment that they would choose to be in, and teaching them the skills to function well there. So kind of bringing the hospital into the community in a way. And a lot of the things that were found to be really effective about this approach was involving the patient from the beginning, kind of talking with them about where do you prefer to live, talking through different ideas of where to live, coordinating their care ahead of time. And those are kind of the aspects of assertive engagement that are so important, that planning involving the person who's going to be at the center. So some of the really important components of assertive community treatment or ACT is having multidisciplinary teams, bringing in the doctor, the psychiatrist, an employment specialist, all the people who are needed to teach those skills, help the person be successful. Having a high worker to patient ratio, 10 participants to 1 staff is our ideal. That's tough right now with staffing challenges, but when we can do that, it's great. And then using home visits, community-based services as the tool. Instead of teaching someone to live in the hospital, which is not our goal for them, we're teaching them not teaching, but working with them to learn how to live in the community with what they're dealing with. And these programs were found to be really successful when they incorporate these elements of treating people in the community. A little bit of delay with my slide here. So a few more of the aspects of assertive community treatment, the way we do it at Pathways. Folks with severe mental health issues and substance use needs. So people given the history, who you might traditionally say should be in a hospital. The interdisciplinary team with a shared caseload. On the next slide, we're going to talk a lot more about some of the benefits of the shared caseload, but we really try not to have one person working with certain people, but everybody on the team gets to know everybody on the caseload. Again, that low ratio, so important if we can get it. The team's meeting every day for rounds to catch up, share information, quickly kind of have everybody on the same page with what's going on with folks and get input on like, oh, well, I don't know if this person took their medication. The psychiatrist can pop up and say, oh, I can get the refill or whatever's needed for extra coordination. Intensive and frequent client contact. At Pathways, we try to see people every 2 weeks at least, but we have a number of folks on our caseload who are at least weekly visits. We, as we'll talk about, we are flexible with what participants prefer, but especially when we're getting to know people, we're not quite sure what's going on, we try to have more frequent contact. 24/7 support in the community, kind of like we were just talking about. Somebody is always available. We have one person at least on call at all times, and that rotates so people don't get burnt out. So there's ability to enforce boundaries and then to be available all the time. And finally, there's no time limit. There's no, you have to achieve these goals by this certain time. People can stay in Pathways program as long as they need to. And for a lot of people, that might be the rest of their life. And for some folks, they're working on other goals. But that takes away a lot of pressure. I don't know if any of y'all have worked in rapid rehousing settings or places where I've worked with folks who got referred to programs where they could live there but needed to have income in the next year. That's not enough time for a lot of folks we work with. And having that pressure can just add so much stress for folks who are already dealing with a lot of trauma from living on the street and from their past experiences. So there's no time limit with assertive community treatment. A little more about the team approach that I mentioned. Everybody, as you know from doing this work, everybody brings a different flavor to their work. Everybody has different skills. And on our teams, in addition to having, a doctor, psychiatrist, administrative support, we also kind of further specialize some folks. We have one person focusing on managing medical appointments, following up on referrals, knowing about medical issues. We have another person who focuses on forensic criminal legal involvement, and they have contacts at the public defender's office or at the probation office. We have a substance use specialist, certified peer specialist. All those people bring really important strengths to the team, and being able to have all the participants work with everyone means that they get access to all those different resources. It also helps with staff turnover. We know turnover is such a huge issue, especially with building trust with people. And when a participant loses their maybe favorite person, it's nice to be able to say, well, you already know these other people too. They'll still be here for you. And there's a sense of ongoing kind of support. Sharing the burdens and joys in that daily rounds, that's where a lot of this happens. Sometimes we have to keep it really task oriented, but other times we can talk about if we lose somebody, we can process what that's like. If somebody's especially feeling burnout, we can talk through that. If we have a success, we can celebrate, like, so-and-so finally got their ID. We've tried to go with them 3 times. They finally showed up this time and went with us and we got the ID. Things like that are so much better when we can talk about them together. We can get really bogged down in what we need to do, and being able to process everything together is really helpful. And then finally, reducing problematic attachment. This is such a tricky one. We care so much about folks, and sometimes it can be hard to keep boundaries. If we have too much in common with a person, or if we've just been working with them for too long, we need a break. I know I have folks I've had to ask my supervisor when I was a service coordinator, like, hey, I know I work well with this person, but I just need a break. And they could rotate them away from me for a little while. Especially these last 2 things, really protect our participants. My big takeaway in my somewhat short social work career is that self-care, protecting yourself, is really for the purpose of protecting the folks you work with. Because when you're not doing well, when you don't have support, you're not going to do good work with folks. So having the team say like, hey, it seems like that interaction got you a little more frustrated than it normally would, or, oh, you kind of came across pretty harsh when you were talking to that person. What's going on? Kind of helps us check each other, take care of each other on the team. And then all of these things together give us what we need to be assertive, to have those frequent contacts, to have different people speak into somebody, have creative ideas. I've seen so many times, I have colleagues who work so well with certain participants who they barely will talk to me. And that's fine, we can take turns, but it really helps us to kind of have those ongoing services and contacts and bring the strength of multiple people to the interaction. I saw a comment. Yeah, you can't pour into people if your cup is running empty. Totally. We all need that reminder frequently, I think. And having a team is definitely helpful.
And I think when we're talking about people who are quote unquote like difficult to engage, we have to pour a bunch, right? It takes a lot of pouring into cups, right? To really connect with that person and help them navigate towards ongoing engagement, right? And so it takes a lot. And that's our point of kind of talking about the ACT structure here, is that like it is a structural piece for us in an organization. You can't do this work alone, especially in an ongoing way. The impact of vicarious trauma will be too much for a single person, right? And so that's why we really emphasize this team approach and all of these benefits. So let's dive a little bit more into like what is assertive engagement and spend some time defining it. One way that we can understand assertive engagement is this process where we're using our interpersonal skills and all of our creativity that we can muster to make the environment and or the circumstances that our folks are in more conducive to change, right? We talk so much in our field about change, the change process. In this case, the change that we're talking about is simply the change to engage, right? The change to say, okay, I'll come inside, or I'll have this conversation with you, right? At this point in the process, we're not talking about changing people's relationships to substances or changing their relationship to mental health providers necessarily. It's really just the change of, can we connect with this person right now, right? So how do we shift environments or shift circumstances to make them more conducive to change? And really what we're wanting to do is find any small way to increase high quality, valuable contact, right? So we're asking ourselves this question: what do I need to do with my client to get some contact with them and to make it more valuable? They're unwilling to talk to me right now, or let's say they're already housed, but they're disengaged. What do I need to do to just get them to crack the door open so I can like make eye contact with them, right? And make that valuable. Those are some of the small successes, I think, that we'll be able to build on, right? So we're asking ourselves that question: what more do I need to do with my client to get some contact and make it valuable? I think really importantly, the process of assertive engagement is not coercive, right? And so we sometimes will talk about assertiveness as being on a spectrum between passiveness, right? Passiveness might be, well, I kept leaving voicemails and they just don't seem to want to call me back. They just don't seem to want to connect, right? I gave the agency template letter. I slipped it under their door. They're just not connecting. I can't do more work than they're doing, right? Like that kind of approach I might describe that as passive. Aggressive might be more intense than that. Like we're beating down their door and calling and threatening, maybe would be a more aggressive approach, right? Hey, if you don't connect with me in the next 3 days, I'm going to have to close your case out. Kind of putting like hard limits like that are more coercive in nature. We're going to evict you if you don't do X, Y, and Z. And so assertiveness, I think, is kind of right in the middle of that spectrum. It's in the middle between passiveness and aggressiveness. And importantly, when I think about the housing first model that we come from, we try and it's built into the model to be non-coercive, right? To be assertive but non-coercive. So one of the fidelity measures in Housing First says the program does not engage in coercive activities to promote engagement or treatment adherences among participants. And so if we find ourselves doing coercive things, A, we're not going to be supporting a strong therapeutic alliance, and B, we're kind of in violation of the housing first principle for those very same reasons. And then lastly, we're defining assertive engagement as activities and approaches that support autonomy, right? And so when we think about autonomy, we're thinking about choices, and a person's ability to kind of have what they need inside that we support so that they can achieve the level of independence that they say that they want, right? Remembering back on that process of disengagement slide, people report wanting to be able to manage their lives themselves and wanting to achieve a level of independence. And so anything that we can do to support autonomy and choice is going to fit this definition of assertive engagement. And I'll also say, just because we talk about engagement as like happening at the beginning of our work with somebody, assertive engagement occurs throughout the work, right? It's not just at the beginning. And I think this comes up all the time when I think about people who we start with a really good relationship and then they decide for whatever reason they don't want what we have to offer. So they've already got their apartment, but we're supposed to be seeing them every 2 weeks and kind of keeping an ongoing connection, but they say that they don't want that anymore, right? And so we have to continue to assertively engage folks, even after that initial, let's say, acceptance of treatment or acceptance of the relationship, right? Because relationships are dynamic. They change over time. We say or do one thing that triggers a whole new approach from them, right? And so we need to kind of like be on our toes with the assertiveness in an ongoing way. And so when might assertive engagement be most useful? Well, when people need to change something. And so I'll kind of refer back to like the stages of change. People may not always identify that they need to change something in the same way that we do, but they are able to identify discomfort, distance from their own goals. I just think that their identification of their own needs and what needs to change may sound different than the way we would identify those things, right? But there is some identification there, some discomfort, some unmet need, right? And so when that's happening for folks, assertive engagement is perfect. Also, when we believe that professional support can be a part of that change, whether that be because of the resources that we have or that whole team of interprofessional folks, right? They've got some legal problems, so we'll bring in our forensic liaison, right? Or they've got employment problems, we'll bring in our employment liaison. When we think that professional support can be a part of change, perfect. And then we'll note, of course, that some circumstances and environments are going to be more conducive to change than others. It can be really tough to engage folks when Hannah has once talked about a case where like sometimes a big tipping point for folks is when the weather changes, right? When it gets too cold. That's an environment that might be conducive to change, right? They don't want to be outside anymore, right? And they know that we're required during Code Blue, if somebody's not willing to come inside, to involuntarily hospitalize them. And so that changes the whole calculus of whether they want to engage with us or not. Yeah, so that's just one example that I can think of, but I'm sure you all can think of many more examples of circumstances and environments that are more conducive to change than others. If I've got a bunch of drug dealers around me, maybe who have taken over my apartment, and I'm feeling sort of intimidated into a certain set of behaviors, that I'm not very conducive to change. It's not very conducive to change, right? And so finding ways to kind of separate that person from those drug dealers, I can kind of hear from them directly about, are they feeling vulnerable? Are they feeling taken advantage of? May be a way that we shift the environment or the circumstances. And in fact, many of the folks that we're attempting to engage on a regular basis, their environments are not conducive to change. And so this is perfect for an assertive engagement conversation. I want to kind of highlight 3 sets. I found a resource out of Multnomah County. And I don't know, I just like this way of approaching the work, right? So this, I offer this as a way to kind of put in your background as you're engaging folks in an assertive way, 3 sets, your mindset, your skill set, and your heart set, right? So the mindset involves kind kind of your mental approach to people and how you view them, right? And so always kind of thinking through a strength-based lens. We'll talk more about what strength-based practice looks like, but what assets does this person have that's going to allow them to be successful in this engagement, right? People are inherently capable of change, of recovery, of health and well-being. And so really tapping into that, even when they can't see it for themselves, is one crucial way that we show up with that kind of piece of hope. And then thinking through, how do we identify their own cultural strengths, right? We talked about the impact of culture last session. And so what sort of cultural strengths make them make it possible to shift the circumstances and environments in their favor? Thinking through the skill set, we'll talk so much about motivational interviewing today. That's one critical tool set. I know that's not unfamiliar to most folks, but I will say I've been pretty deep in the latest edition of motivational interviewing, the 4th edition. It just came out like within the last few weeks. And there is so much that doesn't get talked about in our service settings in motivational interviewing. There's so many skills, so many resources. I really encourage folks to pick up a motivational interviewing book because there's so much good stuff in there. Culturally responsive and specific tools. And we did talk last session about the impact of our own implicit bias and the way we can mitigate those things. And then finally, the heart set, which again, we talked last session about the impact of trauma and how and where it comes from. Addressing our biases and judgments, and then this concept from Carl Rogers and client-centered therapy, which is unconditional positive regard, right? Viewing people without judgment, and not as if we can control their behavior in any way, but sort of showing up with care and concern in a non-judgmental way. I do see the comment in the chat, any book you recommend? And I'm specifically talking here, I'm going to put it in front of the screen. Specifically talking about, oh, blur. No. There we go. Motivational interviewing. That's what it's called.
Miller and Rolnick? I was going to type it in. Okay.
Yep, it's Miller and Rolnick. It's called Motivational Interviewing, Helping People Change and Grow. It's the authors of the whole model of motivational interviewing. They just came out with this new edition, and it's so good. I really strongly recommend it. Okay. That's the kind of background. Those are the 3 sets that we want to kind of keep in mind, and we're going to dive into a lot of that more. But let me kick it over to Hannah to talk about some specific components of motivational interview. Of assertive engagement.
Yeah, we're going to return to each of those kind of sets, ways of being as we go. But we wanted to kind of talk about specific kind of steps or tools for this process, and we divided them into tactics and approach. And I wanted to kind of talk through, this is how we approach pretty much any relationship. We have like a set of steps or things we're doing, and then we have a way we're doing it, kind of what our goal is, what our approach, our posture is. And I was thinking about this as when you're trying to make a new friend, which is not easy, especially after you're done with school and all those things. And the tactics we're going to talk about are kind of like those steps you take. Like, to make a friend, you need to make plans. You need to show up. You need to text them when you think about them. If you were going to kind of write someone a how-to manual of how to make a friend, those are some of the steps. But if you just do those things without the approach of, I genuinely care about this person, I'm curious about them, we have shared interests and values that allow us to enjoy spending time together, that has to be in your how-to book too. If you just check off those boxes, you're not going to make a friend. So when it comes to engaging people, building a relationship in this way, the tactics we're going to go through here are some of those kind of steps, those check boxes. What are the things to do? The first one we've got here is performing direct outreach to each person where they are geographically. And I know not all of you are in housing context, but for us, when we're meeting folks on the street, we get information about some cross streets. We connect directly with outreach workers to know exactly where they are, and we go there. They might not even know they've been referred to pathways, and we'll talk through how we handle that. But central to our model is based in the community. Our participants might not even know where our office is the whole time they work with us. We go to them. I went too fast. another one of, meeting people where they're at, exactly. And sometimes people, like you said, use that as a metaphor, emotionally fit their readiness, and we do mean it very literally in this bullet point here. Being useful to the patient from their perspective. Ryan will talk a little bit about some feedback we got from participants about what helps them engage. But like with Carla, that case study, bringing things that people really appreciate, water, food, a sandwich, remembering their preferred coffee order at Wawa. Those are the things that might be the most useful to them in that moment. Being consistent, showing up when you say you're going to, showing up every Tuesday, whatever that looks like. Engaging people and making informed choices about their lives. Making sure they're involved. Oh yeah, Brian mentioned I just referred to Wawa like you'd all know what that is. That's our beloved convenience store here in the Philadelphia area. So much more than that though. But they have good coffee. Yeah, I just got distracted thinking about Wawa coffee. Engaging people and making choices. Like we were talking about with that, the history of assertive community treatment, involving people in the process from the beginning, like, hey, discharge planning is happening. What do you want? Where do you want to be? Making sure they're part of those conversations at every step. And acknowledging when there aren't a lot of choices. We have situations where people lose their apartment for whatever reason, they're going to be rehoused, and we say, hey, if you want to stick with us, unfortunately, this is the only option. I understand that's frustrating. What can we do to do the best with what we've got? Being honest about that, acknowledging the frustrations that can come with lack of choice. We also have, this is making me think of the lack of options. We have folks who say, well, I want to live in a mansion, or I want to live in Center City, right in the most expensive area of Philadelphia. And we have to talk with people like, hey, that's not going to be a real option. What could we do that gets us closest to what you want? Avoiding controversial topics at initial engagement. People will sometimes kind of try to scare you off by bringing up some things that they think might make you react. Or they might say at that first engagement, hey, I really want a mansion. That's all I want. I might not come out right away contradicting that at first. Kind of be open to what else is going on there to learn more. Allowing them to set limits and exercise control. If you plan for a 30-minute visit with this person, they only want to talk for 2 minutes, honoring that limit. If you plan for a 30-minute visit with that person and they want to talk for an hour, 45 minutes, if you have the flexibility doing that so that you can show them you're willing to go at their pace. Again, meeting them where they're at, this time kind of with time. Especially when I'm working with people on the street, I try to, because that's their home, that space on the sidewalk or wherever it is. Try to honor that, like not step on blankets, not kind of step too close into their space, to honor that space. Ask before I like sit down or crouch down next to them, whatever that looks like. And communicating your role clearly. Like I said, we're walking up to folks, they've never heard of Pathways. I try to say right away who I am, why I'm there. Ooh, I like that, Shauna. Like if somebody's staying in a doorway, kind of knocking on the wall next to them, kind of acknowledge that you're entering or kind of asking to be invited into their space. And back to communicating your role. I worked with folks who were staying in a tent city in Chicago, and they said people were coming up to them all the time, offering them different things, most of which didn't turn out to be real, or offering them to stay for a night or two, and then kicking them out. So kind of just being really clear about who you are, why you're there, what your motivations are. Responding to medical issues is another kind of checkbox area. We want to care about folks where they are. As you're working with folks with opioid use issues, we know that wounds are a big issue, safety, all those things, and acknowledging that those might be top of mind for people over housing, over whatever other services you're offering them, and offering them support in those areas can be hugely helpful. So those are all the kind of checkbox things we wanted to talk through a little bit about the approach, which goes back to that kind of heart set Brian was mentioning.
Can I say one more thing about one of
Yeah.
the bullet points you mentioned? I think we're so accustomed to like taking control in I'm thinking about this one of allowing the patient to set limits and exercise control in the interaction. I think we're so accustomed in the helping professions, or at least I had been, to like, okay, the meeting is going to look like this. First, I want to talk to you about this, and then I want to get your signature on this page, and then we got to do some goal planning, and we're so like programmed, I think, as helpers, or especially as helpers who are like responsive to, you know, Medicaid provider, you know, whoever we have to bill to or whatever, that I think this comes as second nature, and we need to sort of give some of this up, right? Yes, we do have to do X, Y, and Z. You know, we do have to do this needs assessment, and yes, we do have to do this goal planning document, and yes, I need your signature. All that does still have to happen, but especially around the engagement process, allowing people to set their own limits and guide the direction, even offering, hey, what could this time look like, right? We've got about 30 minutes together. What things do you want to cover today? Can be such a kind of a passing of control. And that control is so important because of the way we talked about last time, that the experience of interacting with our systems can be a form of trauma, right? Which is a loss of control and a loss of safety. And so this is like giving control back to folks and letting them guide. And maybe they don't have any idea. We can offer some suggestions. Hey, what if we talked about this? I noticed that you mentioned these health issues. Is that something that you want to talk more about? We're giving control back to them instead of just us kind of coming hammering them with what we think needs to happen.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think we're going to come back to that over and over, kind of turning over that control, the agenda we have. And I don't know if we talk about this training, but just to acknowledge that agenda comes from a place of concern for us. We have to get all these things done to get this person in, and it's not going to work if we're not actually listening to what they prefer and what is important to them. That's kind of an approach that we want to kind of check all of our checkbox things against these approaches, to say, if I'm doing this thing, but I'm not doing it in this way, it's not going to be effective. So I won't have as many direct examples for this. This is kind of how we're going to check ourselves as we go. Building relationships through empathy. We'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But our focus, our approach as we engage with folks is building that relationship. So showing people we care about them as people, and we want to know them. Identifying their strengths and goals. It's easy to focus on the problems. That's what our systems train us to do. Your boss might be concerned about risk and, you know, covering yourself or whatever's going on, and returning to focusing on what that person's strengths are, what their goals are, what's going well for them, what they know how to do already. Exploring what gives them meaning and purpose. These are things that are hard to do for ourselves. But if we are working with someone, they are talking a lot about how important it is to them to be able to see their kids more often. That's something that's so important for us to know, and gives us a lot of information about what's going to be important to them moving forward. Honoring their choices, not trying to directly contradict them, even when their choices don't make sense to us, respecting that that's a choice they're making. Demonstrating flexibility. Again, this is about honoring their boundaries, letting them have control, being flexible. A lot of people brought up the fact that people don't have phones. That's such a easy thing for us to forget what that's like, not to have a phone, and to have the flexibility to know, like, there's probably a good reason they couldn't show up. I'll be flexible. I'm not going to punish them for not showing up. Being non-threatening. This one is so important to hold. I'm thinking about that kind of checkbox thing of being concerned, helping people engage medically. If we do that in a threatening way, that's not going to be effective. Like, hey, if you don't go to the doctor today, you know, your wound's going to get infected and you're going to lose your arm. That might be true. It might be come out of a place of concern for us, and that's a threat. And that's not something that's going to cause somebody to want to engage, to want to build a relationship. There's a way of
even if it does, like, temporarily, right? It might work right now,
yeah,
but the long run
point.
is they're not going to stay with you. They're not going to continue to engage. Sorry to jump in on you, Hannah.
No, that's a great point. yeah, you might get immediate results, but you're not going to have that long-term relationship. And that doesn't honor their choices. Oh, and this one's very related to that, balancing communicating concern without being threatening, like saying what your perspective is, what your concerns are, and still giving them space to make that decision for them. Kind of tries to level that power dynamic while still not withholding information or concern that you have. That's that like assertive balance we want to have. Being passive might be to say, well, you know what to do, like whatever you decide is fine. Being aggressive might say, hey, go get this care right now, or this is going to happen, or I'm never going to talk to you again, or whatever it is. And assertiveness might be to say, I'm concerned about you. This is what I know about what's going on with you medically. What do you want to do? This is what I would like to see happen. And I know this is your choice. I know there's reasons you might not want to go to the doctor today. What does that look like for you? Oh, I was just looking at the comments here.
Yeah, I was trying to engage folks around this question, and I'll say it out loud.
Yeah.
We talk about the importance of building relationships through empathy, and often like empathy, like literal back and forth call and response empathy statements can be the kind of initial steps towards engaging somebody who's not really wanting to engage with us, right? And so I was wondering whether folks, we'll talk more about what empathy is, but it involves like understanding what's going on with a person and like communicating that back to them, like reflecting it back to them. And so I wondered whether folks find it hard to express empathy when people are doing things that are not like sort of socially acceptable, right? Like maybe I'm not an opioid user and I can't relate to that. I wonder if that gets hard. Does it get harder to express empathy? And if it does, that's going to like block our opportunities to engage with folks through this relationship. I'm seeing folks that are responding saying no. Shauna says no, especially because we do not know what led to these choices. It feels up to us as helpers to still meet where they're at and develop an understanding of who the person is as a whole. Absolutely. Even if you don't agree with the things that they're doing, their behaviors that they're engaged in, or the ways that they're living their lives, we're trying to figure out what led them there, right? Like there's a story there that is valid, and tapping into that story is going to be the way that we get to know them and ultimately engage them. So I love that comment, Shauna. Cool.
Yeah.
I want to kind of just pause here and ask. Oh yeah, Lee also adding in the chat, we could be the only people they encounter who don't judge them. I love that.
Including
You
themselves,
could be
right? Yeah.
Yep, including themselves, Hannah said. Let's just pause there. Are there questions, comments, thoughts that are coming up for people? I think we're kind of at a good pausing point here for the training. So I want to kind of welcome some questions and comments. And then after that, we'll take a short 5-minute break and dive back in. Casey mentioning understanding their choices are likely due to trauma, a band-aid for a bullet hole often. Absolutely. And then Jacqueline noting that I think there's a need to have self-awareness of our own biases and triggers. And that's what I was trying to tap into with my question there. Yeah, because I think sometimes these things are blind spots for us, and we have a hard time expressing empathy to folks because of some of these blind spots and these biases that we may carry, right? So thanks for speaking to that, Jacqueline. Okay, so let's pause there. I have 8 minutes past the hour. Let's come back at 13 minutes past the hour, let's say, and we'll dive back in where we're going to talk a little bit more about how do we define success? How do we know that we're successfully engaging folks? And what are those factors? So we'll see you in a few minutes. All right, welcome back from break, folks. Before we dive in a little further, I had posed a question, but I don't think I offered enough time for folks to type. And so a really neat comment came in right before we went to break from Patrice that said, I've had a situation where I thought we had a breakthrough. The client emoted and cried, but then canceled the next appointment and didn't want to meet any longer. I've been told, quote, it's too much like therapy. I think this is a fascinating and interesting just challenge, which is that, it's not always acceptable in our culture and our societies to be vulnerable, right? And so I think that moment was a really significant moment for that person, if I had to guess. And I think you're perhaps tapping into a whole other set of traumas or circumstances or lived experience that mean that it's not okay to kind of emote in that way and to be vulnerable in that way, Patrice. But I don't think that was not valuable, right? I know that person dropped off and didn't come back, but I think the way that we continue to engage folks and let them know that it's safe to kind of be that level of vulnerable is the more important part. Hannah, I think you mentioned that you have experiences too. I'd be curious to know kind of just your take on it and where you're at.
Yeah, I had this very situation happen with somebody in my therapy practice. And I remember also thinking like, wow, that was a good session. We really got into like some of these emotions. This client was working on trying to experience emotions instead of push them down. And yeah, she ghosted after that. And I think for me, reflecting on that was realizing that might have been too much for her in that session. I think what Ryan said is important too, that there's stigma, there's maybe embarrassment there that's possible. And also that sometimes people aren't at a place where they're ready. They might say they want to be experiencing those emotions, and they might not be in a situation or in a life circumstance where they are able to do that and still complete their daily lives. Or for some of our folks in more intense circumstances, they might not be able to survive if they're experiencing sadness, tears, intense emotions while they're trying to literally survive on the street or access get well, whatever that looks like. Um, that's something, yeah, we can't quite know. I think that's also an opportunity to kind of respect that choice, um, ask for feedback, but if we don't get it, to know that they are making a choice for a reason.
I think it's also valuable as people are noting in the chat. Casey, I think, is alluding to this. We can think about like stages of change here too, and maybe as Hannah and Casey are mentioning, like maybe this person wasn't ready for that set of questions that led to that level of emotion, right? And we have to do a little bit of work around preparedness, right? Like, is this person ready for this? Perhaps Patrice, like, ooh, this is the thing, this is the breakthrough, it's coming, and I'm going to ask these questions in this way. But was that person ready? And I think that offers us tools in our future practice too, right? Like who are we going to work with down the line, and how do we know that they're ready to start of like make that step into that vulnerability? Yeah, Casey mentioning, do they have outside support to do that, to feel it, to know this? And we can do some work, especially when I think about folks who practice EMDR, which is a trauma-focused therapy. I know we're not talking therapy here, but in that modality, they talk quite a bit about kind of building up support mechanisms, internal support mechanisms, before they even dive into the work. And I think in some level, we can do that with our folks too, especially if we think that there's some deep trauma under the surface. Yeah, Patrice saying it took you by surprise. So that I think, again, more learning there. Wow, I didn't know this person was that close to this point. What were the indicators? Can we kind of walk it back and understand, what would I do differently? What would I not? Maybe it's okay that it played out the way that it played out. I think it's worth kind of just continuing to process that as you engage with other people down the line. Okay, I want to kind of shift our focus to defining success when we assertively engage with folks. And so we did kind of show elements of this slide the last session. The Therapeutic Alliance. When we talk about the Therapeutic Alliance, what we're talking about is the quality of the interpersonal relationship between us and the client. And I think really importantly, I want to say here, you see the word therapist and you see the word therapeutic. I want to be really clear here that the Therapeutic Alliance is not something that only happens between a therapist and a client, right? Any helping professional can engage with somebody along the lines of a Therapeutic Alliance, because we're talking about these elements here, right? Trust, respect, genuine affection, and collaborative and purposeful work. That's pretty basic stuff. I wish that all of our relationships had all of these elements. They don't always, unfortunately. But when we can bring that to the table, then the quality of the Therapeutic Alliance is going to be increased. Why does it matter? Research has been done to death around this concept. And what we consistently find is that it doesn't really matter what approach you use, right? What modality you use. Are we using motivational interviewing? Are we using CBT? Are we using DBT? Are we using EMDR? All these kind of therapy modalities. What matters more than any of that is the working alliance, the therapeutic alliance. That's always going to be the thing that predicts successful outcomes for folks. And research shows that over and over again. And so the therapeutic alliance is simply a way to define and measure all of these elements: the trust, the respect, the affection, the collaboration, right? We often tell people that they need to get help, or, why don't you get help? Why won't this person engage with me, etc. And so we have to understand, I'm kind of referencing back to our content last session, that the communities that we're serving have been pushed to the margins of society, right? Very stigmatized behaviors that people are engaging in, or identities that people are holding. And so, of course, vulnerability is a challenge, right? And accessing support represents tapping into some of that vulnerability, right? I'm also thinking of BIPOC folks who have been taught historically not to share vulnerable feelings. Or maybe there were moments they did feel safe to share and were then punished for that. Or they've had just sort of negative care experiences, as Khalil was talking to us about that last session. And so to me, it sort of raises the stakes here of the therapeutic alliance, raises the importance of tapping into this therapeutic alliance, and which is all to do with relationship and relationship building. The four elements the kind of key components of the therapeutic alliance we want to highlight are these four things. And I think they're things that we can all bring with us, whether we're doing housing first work, opioid use disorder work, rapid rehousing work. I think any kind of work, we can tap into these four components. Number one is lowering thresholds. We often will talk about like low barrier housing or low barrier services. This is what we're talking about here, right? We need to kind of figure out how to engage. If you want treatment and you're here, that's motivation enough, right? And so kind of this is where we start to shed our like program policies and rules that end up being barriers for people, right? When we can. And the relationship piece here is that there has to be a willingness to work with folks who are experiencing active addiction. It shows them that we can believe in them, that they can improve their own circumstances, and that we're here to support that. All these program policies and rules, that's just like, that's stuff that our organization has to worry about, and we can shed some of that stuff, right? The next component is having a neutral stance towards substance use. Your substance use is not good. It's not bad. It just is. It's a part of kind of what you're working with right now. And I think it can be easy for us, if we're not careful, to kind of portray this idea that we know what's best for them, and that what's best for them is they need to stop all this substance use, for example, right? And so taking a more neutral stance can allow us to show up with all of those elements on the left side of the screen: the trust, the respect, the genuine affection.
Can I jump in there for a sec, Brian?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
I just was thinking about, I had a conversation with somebody last week about their substance use, and I've known this participant for a long time, so we've a lot of trust. And he was like, I know that all of this is just morally wrong in the eyes of God, but I like the effects. And he kind of filled in there a whole judgment that I didn't say out loud. And I said, well, I don't know if I necessarily even agree with that. But that was something he internalized from his environment, maybe from even the way I was talking. But we had enough trust where he could vocalize that to me and say, but I like how it feels. And I said, I was so glad he said that out loud, because I was able to say, I am not judging your use. I don't think it's necessarily, I don't agree with what you said. I'm just concerned about, possibilities of overdose. That's what we're talking about here. So that neutral stance, people are filling in judgments even if you're not saying them. So trying to be extra neutral is really important.
I love that. It's such an interesting example. And I think, yeah, it's not just other people themselves, they're holding a non-neutral stance. They're holding judgment of themselves within themselves. And our neutral stance allows them to give voice to some of that. We're not agreeing with that. We're not disagreeing with it. We're just, substance use is like walking a dog is kind of like our opinion on it, right? The next component here is an exploratory approach. And so shift to exploring a client's relationship with drugs. Like, what does it mean to you? And in Hannah's example, the person said, I think it's morally wrong, but it feels good. Their relationship to those drugs is like the way it makes them feel. Other folks, as we talked about last session, may want to use drugs to escape or to kind of manage their trauma, or because all their friends are doing it. So many reasons why people use drugs or other substances, right? And our approach should be exploratory. I just want to understand like what it is. Like, what are your motivations? What are you getting out of it? There has to be something positive that you're getting out of it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing it, right? In the face of all the negatives that seem to be hitting you, there must be some positives to it. Let's understand what those are. Let's understand the whole range of possibilities there. And then finally, collaboration. We're coming to the table with some expertise. The participant is coming to the table with some expertise on their own life. They are the expert of their own life. And we don't want to be perceived as somebody with an agenda, right? We're trying to get them to do X, Y, and Z. And so at every step of the way, we're trying to emphasize this partnership, this collaboration. And here in the collaborative part, we're really kind of trying to emphasize, like, what do you want for yourself? We might not even use the word goal, but that's really what we're talking about, right? What do you want your life to look like? How can I be a part of that process for you? I have the resources. I've got the time. How can I collaborate with you? I think there's a lot going on in the chat, so I want to like tap into that a little bit. Madison saying, often clients won't be super upfront during intake about what they're using, or will say things like, yeah, I smoke, but I've never be someone who shoots. And we always go, wouldn't mind or judge even if you did. Yeah, they might just be testing the water there. Maybe they do shoot, or maybe they don't. Maybe they know people who do, maybe they don't, right? And so even when they make sort of what seems like offhanded comments, there's something behind that. There's a reason for that. Hannah, did you want to add on?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, even if they don't now, if they don't inject now, they might later. And how you respond in that moment is going to affect whether they tell you. Yeah. That's a great response.
Dawn saying, I had a client tell me they were Cali sober, in recovery for all substances except weed. It's a pretty common term. We hear that a lot too, Cali sober, California sober. I must say a lot about California though, right? Is there stigma behind that statement? I think it's kind of silly, but yeah. Okay, so that's the Therapeutic Alliance. Let's examine more components of therapeutic success. So we talked about using assertive engagement to kind of alter the environments and the circumstances that people are in towards change. And that change is engagement with us, right? Engagement with the program, engagement with a person, et cetera. And we'll have to make some adjustments to those environments and circumstances to make it most effective, right? One thing that I like to think about here is, imagine, if you could for a second, the perfect circumstance and environment to getting somebody to helping somebody change. What would it look like? Are you in an office? Are you on a walk with them? How much time do you have? What level of like resources do they have? Do they have funds? Do they have enough to eat? Imagine all of the perfect environments and circumstances that you could help somebody. And now compare that to what's actually happening with your participants, right? With your clients. And here it's so easy to see the shortfall, right? It would be so much easier to conduct therapeutic alliance type work if there was a quiet environment to do it in. But so often Hannah's engaging folks who are on busy streets or like in encampments, and it's loud and there's a lot going on and people are agitated, right? And so it's easy to see the shortfall. And so what we're trying to do in assertive engagement is like narrow that gap, right? To get closer to, how do we bridge the gap between what would be the ideal and where we are now? So some things that contribute to effective environments and circumstances: when the will to change is present. People are like noting that there's something that they're willing to change. yeah, I'm willing to like go on a walk with you away from this encampment because it's too loud. Or yeah, I'm willing to like hop in the car and go see the doctor with you. I don't want anything else, right? Or we have this one example of a person who the only way we could get this person to engage was eventually over some time, I think it was after months, he eventually let us take him to the eye doctor, right? And so there's a will to change that's present. Another thing that's effective is having a safe environment where people can feel emotionally safe and also physically safe. People have to have their basic needs met. They have to like have full bellies and have rest and be warm or cool enough. Their basic needs should be met. There has to be sufficient time is one of the things that I think about, right? And so often in like the hustle and bustle of our daily work, as well as the hustle and bustle of a client's life, there simply isn't enough time. And then finally, there should be sufficient evidence that positive change can occur, that it's possible. So some of the kind of adjustments that we can make. Number one, we can help tweak people's motivation. I think people think that motivation is like a static thing. And the folks in motivational interviewing say, no, motivation can be tweaked through relationship. Trying to figure out whether people are ready, willing, and able, and how do we remove barriers to those things is a way that we tweak motivation towards change. Creating or finding spaces where emotional and physical vulnerability are possible. That could be back at the office. Maybe we bring them back to the office. That could be, Hannah talks about, I'm sorry, Hannah, I'm giving all your good lines away, but Hannah once asked somebody like, where can we talk that's private? This is our first chance to meet. And they suggested like the rose bushes at the gas station, right? And so stepping into the bushes felt like safe enough and private enough for that person. But we can continue to do work around finding safe spaces and creating safe spaces for people, helping them meet their basic needs. One of our greatest tools is showing up with a sandwich and a cup of coffee with folks, right? When they haven't had a good meal to eat. That's a crucial adjustment that we can make. We can try to make the limited time that we do have available with folks more valuable. How can we buy their time with food or other offerings, right? Material benefits. And then sometimes we can really try and understand their patterns of behavior so we can know where and when they're going to be, right? So many of our folks start their day by quote unquote getting well. And then after some time, they'll be ready to like start their day before they do some more hustling and trying to buy more drugs, right? And so maybe there's a critical time right in the middle where they're like clear-headed enough that we can have some conversation and they're like focused, right? We can understand that through relationship. And then ultimately trying to kind of mitigate the impact of external stressors will be pretty crucial. A nice analogy that I like here is the analogy of a paramedic, right? A paramedic does what we might call medical work, right? But the essence of being a paramedic is not the fact that they're out in the field, which is true, right? A doctor is in a hospital, a paramedic is out there in the field. But the essence of their work isn't that they're in the field. It's that they define themselves by how they compensate for the shortfall, by the lack of having a hospital there. I don't have a hospital here, but I do have this bed and I do have these tools, right? And so they're compensating for the ideal environment out there in the field. And we're doing the same thing through our assertive engagement. No, this is not the ideal place where I'd like to engage people. But here's the way that I'm trying to make adjustments. I see Teresa's question in the chat. Can you give an example of what sufficient evidence that positive change can occur would look like? I think any willingness to engage in conversation with you is sufficient evidence, right? If we know that the therapeutic alliance is going to be the thing that shifts everything for this person, any conversation they have with us is an opportunity to offer empathy, to kind of do reflections, to be non-judgmental. And that's always going to be your like foot in the door. However, I will also say, I guess I struggle with this bullet point because there are so many people on our caseloads who don't engage with us for long lengths of time, sometimes years at a time. And we still keep their case open and try to engage them. We're looking for like the tiniest the eye contact, any level of willingness to engage says to me that change could occur. Do you have other ideas there, Hannah? Anything that's popping up in your head?
Yeah, I think what you said makes sense. I think, yeah, people showing up is evidence to me. I'm trying to think of like an instance where there hasn't been evidence that change can occur. I think about engagement with we work with who maybe pose safety concerns, and we don't anticipate that changing anytime soon. Or folks who have very little insight into their situation, and that's going to change. But we usually try to engage them for a long time before making that decision. So I guess that's kind of that process of looking for any evidence over that time. Yeah.
Another thing that your comments kind of brought to my mind towards Teresa's question is we have some folks who, we're a housing program. We want to get people housed. I don't care if you're using drugs, not taking care of your mental health, your physical body, etc. We want you off the streets because we're committed to ending homelessness, at least for these individuals that we're serving. But we do have some folks that being in a home would be counter to their autonomy. They simply do not and will not want to be in a home. And they've said it to us in no uncertain terms, very clear. We've got the one person under a bridge with a generator and a bread maker and a nice tent. He does not want to leave. And eventually we stop trying to engage him in the process of coming into a home. And if in the future, in his discussions with other Philadelphia outreach workers, if he says, I think maybe I am interested in getting a home, we'll be right there to pick his case back up. But we've let cases like that go because the direction of his autonomy said, no, I don't want anything that you have to offer. I want to be out here living my life. Please leave me alone. And so that's tough.
Yeah.
Well, that's what it is.
Yeah. And I think we took a lot of time to see if that could change. And even after building trusting relationships, after supporting with other resources, after he'd call on us for help, the idea of housing was still not at all something he was interested in. So, yeah.
Casey mentioning, I have clients that say they want to engage but might miss a few visits with me, but they'll message me every so often. This is a door that stays open for us. I'll ask them, how can I support you in getting to our meetings? Absolutely. That person is still on the verge. That person is not engaged, right? But there are some barriers, whether they're emotional barriers or logistical barriers. And so, yeah, there's a ton of work to do with a person like that. I'm glad you mentioned that example, Casey. Okay, I want to talk to you about things that we understand from participants, right? We have so much to say about like how to engage folks, but participants have a lot to say about what it means to be engaged and how it feels to be engaged. And so there's been some research around this, qualitative research to get people's perspectives. And what people say is that engagement is a process of gradual acceptance, right? When we showed up enough times, eventually they accepted us into their lives. We were just around. We didn't go away. And we didn't do it in an aggressive way. We did it in an assertive way. But gradually they came to understand who we were and what we were about and that we were there to help them. Hannah mentioned the example of tent encampments where so many people are walking up to our folks all the time, offering them things that sometimes are real, sometimes are not. And I think the passage of time is a good indicator to folks that like, oh yes, this person does want to help me because they keep showing up. It's been 3 years. Okay, fine. I'll talk with you, right? Like that kind of level of gradual acceptance. Another thing that people say is that having a trusting relationship and receiving benefits have the greatest impact. I'm talking about material benefits. Literal, physical, and material help is a thing that contributes to a trusting relationship. How do I know that I can trust you? You helping me keep my belly full, right? Or you're helping me keep a shelter over my head. Or you're helping me with the things that I say I want. Another example that we sometimes give is you do not need a bunch of paperwork and an ID and all that stuff to come into our program. When we show up doing outreach with you, you're eligible for an apartment. We have a housing subsidy on your behalf. But sometimes folks say, no, I got to do all that. I got to get my ID and I got to do X, Y, and Z before that. We're like, no, just come inside first, then we'll help you. And I think kind of following their lead, even if it sort of doesn't make sense to us, has been the most effective thing, that partnership model. When they receive those material benefits that they identify, they're much more willing to kind of move in the direction that we want them to come anyway. And then lastly, here's another one, enduring involvement. So staff showing up multiple times a week, even if previously rejected. This is part of the reason why we talk so much about ACT in the beginning, because the ACT model is what allows us to show up 3 times a week, sometimes 4 times a week, sometimes, if that's what's necessary. I think when you're working in a model where it's like a 1:40 or 1:30 caseload ratio, things like this, it's simply not possible to go see any one person frequently enough to demonstrate this enduring involvement. And it's that enduring involvement that plays a pretty big role in whether people are going to accept and trust us, right? So that's why we focused on ACT. It enables me to go out one day and Hannah to go out the next day and Renee to go out the third day, right? Because we're working as a team on behalf of this person. And then another thing that people say is that sometimes helpers can feel more like surveillance than help, right? It feels more like policing. We're policing their time and their behavior and their values, right? And one way that we show up as cops in people's lives is when we focus too much on medication, right? When we're focusing too much on trying to get them to do the things that we need them to do. And I think this is pretty tricky because often the folks that we are trying to engage, the city is referring them to us because they're trying to quote unquote clean up Center City, right? It's a touristy district and we want those folks off the street, right? And so that is literal coercion that they're asking us to engage in. And so we're trying to fight against that by taking the pace that they're taking and showing them in any way that we can your behavior and your time and who you are is up to you. We're here to support you. And I think the relationship piece will allow us to shift them, allow everybody to meet everybody's needs, I think is the point that I want to say there. Okay. So can we take a walk together? This is the section where we're trying to offer more concrete tools towards this therapeutic alliance, towards the therapeutic working relationship. And I think it's a more thorough description of the approach we use in assertive engagement. So we talked about the many structural barriers that lead to disengagement already, and the ways that those conditions do form a kind of trauma. And so necessarily we have to show up in a trauma-informed way. What this means is that we're doing things that promote a culture of safety and empowerment for folks. Remember the opportunity to make choices, and also healing for folks who have experienced trauma. We're recognizing the widespread impact of trauma, understanding that maybe 100% of the folks that we're working with have experienced a trauma, and trying to understand like where that trauma comes from. What's at the root there, and getting to the bottom of that story is one avenue of relationship that is so important to explore if they're willing and ready and able. We're trying to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. Yes, they're difficult to engage. They seem to be socially withdrawn. I wonder if that's a symptom of trauma. And I wonder if the way that I show up, doing the knock on the door, on the wall, is one kind of simple way to kind of mitigate that and work with a specific symptom of trauma that a person may be experiencing. And then trying to incorporate our understanding of trauma into our policies, procedures, and practices. I would say that it's more trauma-informed to keep somebody's case open for 3 years, despite the fact that they're not engaging with us yet, because we understand how difficult it is to build that trust, right? So we're trying to make this shift from what's wrong with you? Why won't you engage? To what happened to you? Can I know your story? Another crucial tool, I've been talking about it kind of ad nauseum, it feels like so far in this training, is motivational interviewing. I think sometimes MI is described as a way to get people to change. And from that framework, it can feel like sort of manipulation. And I think that doesn't feel good. And that doesn't fit the approach that we're talking about with assertive engagement. So I don't think that's a correct description. MI does assume that the most effective and beneficial changes are going to come from a person's own motivations. So when Hannah talked about like non-threatening ways of engaging with folks, what we're trying to do is cultivate people's own motivation. What things are you dissatisfied with in your life? How do we mitigate those things? That's always going to move us in the direction of better health and wellness, right? So examining people's motivations, examining their willingness, their readiness, and their ability to change. Understanding that change is a process, not an event. And indeed, engagement is a process, not an event, even though we sometimes think of it that way. And ultimately, one of the things that we're trying to do with motivational interviewing is develop some discrepancy, which is a term that they use. When people's behavior is in conflict with a value, they're going to change their behavior. People want to be aligned with their own values. And so evoking people's values is one critical way. What do you care about? What's important to you? How do you like to treat people? How do you like to be treated? Helps people alter their behavior because it's the value that is more long-lasting there. Okay, let me kick it over to Hannah to talk a little bit more about centering client needs.
Yeah, we've mentioned this throughout the training so far, but here's a couple really practical ways that we do this. Like we talked about, meeting where folks feel most comfortable. Yeah, Ryan took my rosebush story, but I like to ask people when they're on the street, if they're in the office, wherever you meet them, especially if you're in a more public place, or sometimes we have a shared team room, so there's always one other person in the office with me, usually our administrative person, and maybe my client just wants to talk to one person. Say, hey, do you want to talk out in the living room? You want to talk in the hallway? Sometimes I have my best conversations with clients when they're waiting for the elevator to go down and leave the office. And I've noticed even if people don't kind of choose a particular spot, even communicating that you're thinking about what they're about to share with you and how that might be vulnerable for them, communicate some care and consideration right when you meet them. Remembering that Housing First is a community mental health program. We meet folks literally where they are in the community. Even our staff at Pathways who tend to be office-based, like our psychiatrists, even some of our medical folks, will make adjustments to meet with people in the community. And we are lucky to have people who are so flexible in that way. And I think a benefit of COVID is that it forced us to be a little more creative with those things when people weren't in the office. Staying flexible. We talked about thinking about what it's like to not have a phone, and remembering that people have survival needs that are kind of come up ahead of meeting with us sometimes. I also try to give people a realistic timeline if they don't have a phone or if they frequently lose their phone, and make sure I'm working around what is best for them. We talked about kind of acknowledging with folks like, hey, I know you need to get well. I know you need to get back down to COP. When's the best time for you? What's the window we can meet? And trying to do your best to adjust your schedule to what works for them. That kind of takes away some stigma and just like, hey, we're just talking about logistics here. I know this is part of your life and I want to work around that for you. Remembering that clients know what they need and that they have preferences. I think to kind of break down the bare bones of what making a change looks like for us, if you think about the last time that you started something new, engaged with something new, like maybe you started going to therapy for the first time or for the first time in a while, you had to find a medical provider for an issue that's been concerning you. You started going to a new gym. If you think about the research you did, why you chose the place you did, you probably got recommendations from friends, or you looked at maybe the identity of the provider you wanted to find. We all have preferences, things that make us more comfortable with engaging with something new. And our clients might not have any choice. They might have gotten referred to your program. This is what they have to work with. So acknowledging that lack of choice and that they're going to have preferences and things they're looking for in choosing whether or how deeply to engage with you is important at every step. And then finally reminding that Our clients are going to pick what's important to them at every step. If we're saying, oh, they're just not showing up or they're not engaging with me around this issue, that's probably not what's important to them in that moment. And also, like Ryan mentioned, remembering that we have stakeholders we're working with who are pushing goals on us. I've gotten calls from police officers, from we get certain funding from parts of the city that want to clear out, and trying to create some distance from that funding, organization pressure, and what the client actually prefers and what they want. That's where we get to step in and be an advocate for the folks we work with. And all those things help us kind of keep their needs at the center. We've mentioned kind of being strengths-based, focusing on what people have to bring. This is, again, about that kind of approach, that heart set mindset. And I think this is a kind of a controversial posture. We're so used to identifying a problem. What do we need to fix? And I think strength-based approach asks us to consider that there's nothing wrong with this person, that they're making the choices they're making for a reason. And maybe hearing that in those words might like land weird for you, and that's fine. We want to hear about that. But we're going to keep coming back to that idea, because I, in my experience, and Ryan, have found that this is the best way to engage with folks, to believe that. So strength-based perspective comes out of motivational interviewing. The idea that people have what they need to make the choice, to make a change. They have it. We help them kind of bring it out of them. This looks like noticing the ways that they make choices and supporting them. Like, hey, you made this choice to come in today. Or, oh, I see that you set up your bed in this way that's going to protect you from the cold. You know so much about surviving out here. That's not something I would have thought to do. Or, oh, you're choosing to, take a break from using, or you're choosing to use a few bags a day, or you're choosing to hang out with people who aren't using so that they can look out for you for an overdose. That's an amazing choice. How about we talk about keeping doing that instead of finding a deficit in what they're doing already, focusing on those things. This means kind of always looking for what are those great choices our clients are already making? What are the opportunities we have to tap into what they care about and what they value? Again, I kind of said that, but yeah, noticing, I think, I don't know if we talk about this on another slide, but motivational interviewing talks a lot about affirming people in really specific ways that see who they are. Instead of, we can kind of get into a habit of saying like, oh, well, you got this, or you're great, or I know you can do it. That kind of is more about us kind of giving them praise, and a kind of strength-based, helping people appreciate what they have, is noticing those specific things. Like, hey, I noticed that last time we talked, you had a hard time kind of not raising your voice at me, and that was really uncomfortable, hard for us to keep talking. And today this is a great conversation. I really appreciate how you're communicating what you need to me. Things like that, noticing what's going well.
Yes, that distinction between affirmation and praise. And affirmation is very specific, as Hannah mentioned. Praise is just like it washes over people in a way that doesn't actually help move them towards change. Affirmation helps lean on any changes that are positive that we're seeing, and it gets people to like build the momentum towards change. Praise is too general. It doesn't do that. It doesn't help us connect and change, help people change.
As we go in, keeping all this in mind, when we first meet people, this is our biggest opportunity. Engagement is a process, and this is where it starts. As we know, for the participant, it started long before we met them. And for us, we're intervening at this moment where they are. So like we've mentioned, saying who you are, why you're there right away. Doing that in a way that communicates concern, compassion. I've seen a few people mention the importance of being mindful of your reactions, where you're at. I like to think about this, especially when I'm doing outreach, especially when I'm meeting someone for the first time. Doing street outreach, I might be cold, I might be hot, this is taking longer than I thought, I couldn't find parking, I'm hungry. All these things are important to remember and try to set aside if we can, to be really genuinely enthusiastic about meeting someone new, and communicating that with them from when we first meet them. Yes, Valerie said nonverbal cues. Totally. Following the client's lead, like we've said, medical issues might be their concern. Access to Narcan, getting clean needles, whatever it is that they're worried about is what we want to focus on in that interaction. We still want to communicate why we're there, why we came, and then shift the control to them, whatever concern is happening there, and following their lead for how long or short they want that interaction to be. That might mean all you do is exchange your name, find out what kind of coffee they like. I've had interactions like that, like, hey, do you want a coffee today? No? If I bring you one next time, what would you like that to look like? That's been the first interaction for me sometimes. Promoting belief in recovery in all interactions. This again comes back to that belief. There's nothing wrong with this person. What have they experienced? What's led them to be in this place? What's good for them about the choices they're making right now? What's it doing for them? And holding that hope that change will happen, that they will be able to achieve the life they want. I noticed, so I think Brenda way back brought up a question about engaging with folks who are engaging in polysubstance use, and they might not be able to communicate super clearly. They might not. I worked with somebody who had a hard time kind of getting a coherent sentence just because of all of the substances that they were engaged in at the time. They had been street homeless for a long time, had been in and out of jail. They had a lot of intense experiences that they were really trying to not experience through those substances. And over time, it can be hard to keep showing up when you feel like, I don't think that person got anything out of the interaction. They know I was there. But over time, we've been able to kind of build trust, build a relationship, get to a point where that person wants to engage. They want to be more present. So I think it's hard to get there if we don't hold for ourselves belief in that person. I always bring up this metaphor of a tree in the winter. If you see a tree in the winter and you don't know much about trees, you might be like, that tree is dead. Nothing's going on there. I'm not going to wait around for fruit or whatever benefit you're hoping for. But once you know something about trees, just like hopefully you know something about people, you know that tree is going to come back and is going to be fruitful. And kind of holding on to that for our clients. I know people did that for me in my life, so that's what I like to think about with my folks. And to remember that our client might not be able to do that for themselves. I've had folks say out loud, I don't feel like I deserve help. I don't deserve to feel better. And that's when we get to believe that for them if they can't do that for themselves. The way we do that is remaining consistent in that hope and possibility, connecting back to what's meaningful for them, the why they're sticking around, why they're showing up. And how we display non-judgment, how we stay open is displaying that patience, reassurance, acceptance at every step. And that leads right into being, this is a different slide than I expected. Sorry, Ryan. Yeah, but being patient, being accepting. I think people are talking about kind of being aware of what your face is saying. We meet people in really dire circumstances, and especially with opioid use, we know that there can be wounds, there can be smells, there can be sites of needles and blood. Those things can be really triggering. They can be concerning for us, and learning how to be accepting even in those circumstances is really important for building that trust from that first interaction.
All right. So turning towards making it count. One of the things that I think about here is that we often don't get much of an opportunity, right? The windows of opportunity to kind of reel people in and get their attention or connect with them are small. And so when we have those moments and when we're creating those moments, we have to make that count, right? For both of us, for everybody in the interaction. And so one of the things that I'll say here is that real is better than perfect. We all know that there are certain scripts to say and certain ways that we get across our points. And we've probably all practiced using motivational interviewing, for example. We may not be perfect at those things, but I think showing up in a genuine way that demonstrates actual concern for people is people can pick, they can read that, right? They can read genuineness and authenticity. And so that's always going to be more important, I think, than like saying the exact right thing. But your genuineness and your authenticity has to be like based in a place of, I actually care about this person. They will read that, right? And so if you're at a place where you're not sure if you do care about this particular person, I think there's work for you to do so that you can show up with that genuineness and that authenticity of, yes, I care. Yes, you're making choices that I wouldn't make for myself. I would choose different things for you, but I care about you, right? And let that come across. Another way that we can make it count is to identify ambivalence. So this goes back to motivational interviewing again. And ambivalence is the fact that like people feel two ways about a potential change. Yeah, I know this is using these drugs are bad for me, but it feels good. Yeah, that moral judgment of like spirituality is there, but it feels good, right? That's ambivalence. And we can lean on any kind of concept of change talk that we do here. But at a minimum, what we can do is like reflect that back to people. Hey, I'm hearing that you feel two ways about this. You're wanting to kind of connect and come into the office, but it sounds like there's other things, other needs that you're trying to meet right now. That's a tough place to be in, right? We can empathize with that ambivalence. Another concept around motivational interviewing is ask, offer, ask. And so it's this 3-step formula. Number one, we can ask first. We can get curious first about people's thoughts about engaging with us before we impart our own thoughts on them, right? What would you like to know more about our treatment program? What would you like to know more about coming inside? Hey, do you have any questions around what it could look like to connect with us? And then we offer. We offer information, but we ask permission before we offer information. And so when we're asking for permission, what we're doing is we're showing people that we value them as a person and we respect their autonomy. Hey, would it be okay if I shared a little bit about the process to coming inside or the process to getting into a treatment program? And if they say yes, then we share everything that we can share with them in that brief moment. And then we ask again, right? So we asked, we offered, and then we ask again. So we're checking back in with people about what we just offered to them, right? And again, the underlying message is one of autonomy. What'd you make of that information that I shared? How does this fit for you? How does this fit into your life? Right? So ask, offer, ask is one kind of quick formula that we can use when we have those brief windows of engagement with folks. Another way that we can think about this is what would it look like to build 3 minutes of connection? Success, like total success with a person, may look like them coming inside off the streets or them engaging in a treatment program or them at least coming into the office once a week. But it's also a success to build 3 minutes of connection with somebody that's not previously connected, right? And so kind of just shifting our own understanding of what success can look like. And 3 minutes is enough. And if we have 10 3-minute connections, that's 30 minutes of time, right? And so that's valuable too, right? And it builds up. Another kind of approach that we can have, and this goes back to nonverbals. People are mentioning this in the chat a bit already, but like, act like you have all day. I don't have anywhere to be. I have no time pressures. And I think this one can get really hard, especially when we've got a lot of clients, or if you're like Hannah, you're a team leader. Anytime I've ever sat in the same room as a team leader at Pathways, their phones are like pinging constantly because of all the group chats of like workers that they're on and all the kind of needs that are being met. And so finding ways to show people, I got all day. I'm not going anywhere. And if that's going to take 2 hours, let's do it, because that's going to be what's needed to connect you. And then Hannah's tapped into this quite a bit, but nurturing hope, right? So I won't say any more about that, but any kind of way that we can nurture hope in the moment for those 3 minutes is going to be crucial.
Coming back to what it looks like to be non-judgmental. A lot of you have brought this up, the importance of tempering your facial expressions. What does that look like? A really helpful component is mindfulness. I know that's a big buzzword in social services and social work. What does it mean what does it really mean in this context? To me, it means being able to have those reactions. We're going to react. I have a participant who struggles with incontinence and is not great at managing that. Everybody knows when he shows up at the office because there's a smell. And I'm not going to be able to train myself to not notice that and to not have a reaction. That reaction is going to happen. I'm going to notice and have a feeling about that. The important thing when it comes to mindfulness is to be able to notice that reaction and choose to display something different, to say something different. For me and this client, we were able to get to the point of non-judgment where he was able to say, like, hey, can you let me know when you notice the smell? Because I really can't tell. And people are telling me this is happening and I don't want it to be an issue. So I'm able to tell him, like, hey, I'm noticing something right now. Do you want to change clothes? Do you need something to help you out? In a way that's not judgmental. I'm trying not to show that on my face, is really important. And this comes back to kind of what you all talked about around uncovering implicit bias. Knowing those biases is so important. I have had clients where I get to the point where I have to kind of take a step back, and knowing that for myself, knowing that our relationship can handle that, and me telling them that is really helpful. So kind of holding all those things together, giving us some space to decide how we react. Having that attitude of acceptance, genuineness, and empathy, all these things we want to cultivate that we've been talking about. Using verbal cues to show that you're listening, like those little or oh, okay, or oh, wow, that must have been hard. Those little things that we bring in. I do this very easily. My friends in school would make fun of me. Oh, Hannah, you're so engaged, because I want people to know I'm listening. Those things make a difference, like laughing at stupid jokes, all those little things that we can show that we're engaged and that we're listening. Keeping positive body language. If you folks, folks have brought this up, eye contact. Yes, Kaylee mentioned that. Sometimes sitting, being at even eye level with folks instead of standing over them, especially when we're on the street, that can be really important. People are so used to people just walking by, not even noticing them. Being angled toward the person, kind of, and not like directly opposite, because that can be kind of interpreted as threatening. Paying attention to where your arms are, your arms crossed in front of you, that can be really closed, even if it's a little more comfortable when we're tired. Trying to notice those things and adjust. Casey mentioned the importance of eye contact, not being distracted by taking notes. Yeah, our agency has a standard for doing real-time documentation, and part of that is to write the note right after the interaction, not during. And I usually prefer to do that because I know I cannot listen as well when I'm trying to type at the same time. Maybe some of y'all are experts at that. Coming back to the training y'all had before, recognizing cultural differences. Some of the things that people interpret as welcoming or threatening might be different from culture to culture. If you're meeting with somebody who, for them, eye contact is kind of disrespectful, knowing those things ahead of time as much as you can, seeking resources about cultural background, if you can, before that interaction can be helpful. And even if you don't know, but you're noticing someone's doing something that for you seems rude or off-putting or threatening, kind of remembering, like, I think I know this person is coming from a different background from me. Let me be open to assuming that this thing isn't an affront to me necessarily from the context of the conversation. And I'm going to learn more about this moving forward. Patrice shared a nice acronym. This looks helpful. Sit squarely, open posture, lean toward, eye contact, relax. That's really helpful. Yeah, we might use that moving forward. I love hearing y'all's suggestions for how to do this. Casey shared that working with folks from indigenous culture, not responding well to eye contact, speaking slower and quieter is important. That's a really helpful point. And somebody made a comment about fairness. I might speak differently with different participants based on what works for them. that can be helpful too, knowing who you're dealing with. This brings me to Daria, another case study. She's a person who was staying on the street, engaged with us over a 2-year process. She's one of the folks who really wanted to stay in Center City, which is the highest, rent, most expensive part of the city here in Philadelphia. That's where she'd stayed on the street for a long time. A lot of our folks, and I'm sure this is true in your context too, want to be where there's lots of resources, lots of people around, there's safety in that, and familiarity there. So it took us a long time for us to get her to consider housing because we didn't have anything in that area. We came to learn that she'd often stay with her mom, who lived in West Philly, where we have some apartments available. And then through time, patience with the housing supply, we were able to find a unit that was kind of in the midpoint, close to West Philly where her mom was living, and easy access to get to Center City, easy bus ride away. She was able to view the apartment, but was still very ambivalent, wouldn't make a decision. And knowing Daria, this is the way she handles a lot of interactions, going to the doctor, having home visits. She's like, well, I don't know, I'm not sure. That's kind of her general posture. So for us, asking her to make a yes or no answer to whether she wanted this apartment just wasn't going to happen. So eventually the team said, how about you just try it? You could move in, see if you like it. If you decide not to stay, you don't have to. And she was open to that. So she was able to make the choice then to move in. And the team working with her still has trouble with her kind of wanting to stay in Center City, staying in this apartment. That engagement process is ongoing, and knowing what is important to her, how to work with her, not reacting with judgment when she decides not to go to the doctor, or when she decides she would rather stay in Center City for the night instead of going back to her apartment. Us being able to hold all those things together is what makes it successful for her to still be in that apartment years later.
Want to talk really briefly now about initiating services. This is important for every engagement, but it might be most kind of valuable in retrospect when people are initially open to services, but then they become less engaged over time. And I don't know about your settings, but this happens with us, right? So we've talked so much about outreach today, but often our engagement is with folks who were already engaged before and that have sort of fallen off. What happened? We lost the connection there somewhere. And so wanting to make sure that people are really clear about the program expectations, clear about our roles. We find that the more clear we can be and give people enough information up front, the smoother things will be on the back end, right? When conflict arises, we can say, hey, remember when we met back in that August time, we talked about the ways that we have to come and see you in your apartment every 2 weeks, right? That's a program policy. And we wanted to remind you that that's on your lease agreement, right? But that's much easier for a person to swallow that when it's already been explained in a clear way up front. They may have forgotten over time, but at least we can reference back to it. If something sort of pops up as a rule or an approach that they had never heard before, they're going to be really resistant to that, right? And so it can be helpful to kind of smooth things out in that way. We're explaining everything so that there's no surprises for folks. But within that, we want to offer as many choices as possible. Your setting may look different than ours, but in our setting, we want to find as many possible choices as we can. What neighborhood do you want to live in? What type of apartment do you want to live in? What could your services look like? What's the array of services that you want to connect with? What's the best time of day that you want people to come visit you? Any choice that we can offer is going to be so valuable to supporting people's autonomy and getting the process started. Part of this includes explaining the staffing structure. Our staff is complicated. You're going to see and meet maybe 10 different staff on your team if it's a well-staffed team, right? And that could be confusing to folks. So kind of explaining how they can file grievances if anything comes up, explaining who's going to see you and when, all of this is pretty critical. And then ultimately, and I think we've referenced this quite a bit, we're always prioritizing in the initiation of services, rapport building over following program rules. So for example, one of the things that's important for folks to join our program is to have a psych eval. Sometimes we will delay that psych eval if it's necessary to build rapport, right? Or find kind of wacky ways to do it, right? Like our psychiatrist will hop on a really quick telehealth chat to get that psych eval done, because we know that that could get in the way of actually initiating with people, right? So we're prioritizing rapport building instead of trying to focus so heavily on our program policies and rules when we can. I see a comment from Jacqueline. Yes to expectations and rapport building. I always like to outline next steps so I'm clear and clients can confirm and or add in anything I'm missing. I like to emphasize their input in the flow of the work and make sure it's not just our voice overpowering the work. I think that's really well said. And I'll add that, you know, we've been talking a little bit in the last couple of chats about like permission, asking permission. And I want us to note that like when we ask somebody for permission, there's still a power dynamic at play. And so we need to be really receptive to like nonverbal cues in that moment as well.
Building trust, y'all know trust is the foundation of relationships. And we've talked a lot about, and y'all have done trainings on why people don't have trust in service providers. I noticed somebody said at the very beginning of the training, especially with medical providers, people who come across as experts and might have a history of using that expertise to harm people. So building trust is a really important foundation, and it takes practice. That's something we want to note. With each new person you meet, it's going to take practice to know, to show up consistently, to know what the sources of their lack of trust might be, to know what is communicating trust to them. Starting with that assumption that they have preferences, that they can find their way to a solution, we've talked about it a lot, and it's a way that we show that we trust them and that they can trust us to prioritize their needs. Removing obstacles whenever possible. We've talked about, we have really limited requirements for people to get started with us. We can be flexible whenever we can. We want to be realistic about changes that we can make. And it doesn't mean doing whatever people ask. We want to model boundary setting. When we can set boundaries with folks, they know they can set a boundary with us as well. So taking away obstacles doesn't mean doing whatever people want in that moment. Letting people set their own pace, being consistent. Talked about that a lot. So important. Being honest. I think we can be tempted to communicate the best case scenario to people. I have somebody right now who has an apartment with a washer, dryer, and unit. That's not going to be something we tell people at engagement, because that is extremely rare. We as service providers love that feeling of feeling like we're giving people good news, like we're helping out. And when we're communicating the best case scenario instead of the most realistic scenario, that's a disservice to our clients. So we want to be honest up front. We want to pay attention to what's going on with folks. This can give us insight into their experiences, the best ways to engage them. I have people who will interact differently based on weather, clients who are really aware of people around and will talk really, really low if someone's walking by. For me to respect that and notice that is really important. This with trust, on top of all the historical reasons people have to not trust us, in their experience with service providers, they've experienced folks who say they're going to do something and they don't. That's just a reality of our field. And showing up, being consistent, doing what you say you're going to do, and apologizing when you don't is a huge way of building trust. A lot of us are hesitant to apologize, but acknowledging that we messed up, we are going to mess up, and apologizing, that has been a big way that I've noticed I can build trust with folks. I had a client who would call us like 5 times if something was going on, and a lot of people on the team started to ignore his calls. And one time he had lost his keys, and it was during the day. Like, somebody could have helped him out with that. He said, well, no one's answering my calls. This is really frustrating. And I came back to him later and I was like, you're right. Like, that's not okay. We should have been answering your phone call. And that kind of led to more trust building with us, and also to him kind of calling less insistently sometimes.
All right, I want to talk a little bit more about empathy. I recognize we're getting pretty close to the end of our time here, so I might move kind of quickly through this. But from the perspective of motivational interviewing, again, the authors Milner and Rolnick, they talk about empathy as the ability to understand and feel what others are experiencing. And I think kind of one main point that I want to get across here is that we all have empathy, but that empathy actually exists on a curve, meaning some of us are perhaps more skilled at expressing empathy than others. And that there's a spectrum there, right? But we can all sort of work towards expressing empathy in the ways that are going to be most helpful for our clients. And so what we're talking about in delivering empathy, it's important to say that it should be accurate, right? And so the way it's accurate is we're trying to take a guess about what a person might be feeling. Hey, I'm hearing that you feel this way. Is that right? And when they correct us, I think we need to be cautious not to be defensive, right? And I've certainly worked with folks where it's like, I'll reflect almost exactly back to them what they say to me. And they're like, no, it's this. And I'll reflect it again. No, it's this. And I can never seem to get it right. And I think that's because that's the process where they're trying to figure out what they feel and what they want to communicate. And even hearing their own words come back to them, it doesn't feel right, right? But that's a useful process, right? Because it's like a hypothesis that we're offering, a guess about what they're feeling, and then a correction. And so being careful not to be defensive when we offer empathy, and continue to like hone in towards the accurate and specific feeling that people are having. This is a relationship and trust building exercise that we can engage in. And so I think if ever you're stuck with what to do, or there's big emotions that people are feeling, or we just don't know how to connect with somebody, start with empathy. Just listen. Do less talking and more reflecting. And I think that door will begin to widen. Another thing that we can do is listen well. And we've been talking about elements of this already, but this is a component of accurate empathy. We have to like shut out distractions and like really tune in. And so part of this is maintaining an attitude of curiosity. Like, I legitimately am curious about what you have to say. I've probably heard the thing that this person has said 15 times already, but how do I like maintain that attitude of curiosity? Like, I want to know about you. And so we have to cultivate that in ourselves. And part of that is taking an active interest in their experience, but from their point of view. Yes, I've got 3 other clients that have experienced the thing that you're telling me about, but I want to know what it means for you. What's your point of view? That's what we're talking about with listening well. It involves complete and undistracted attention. And then there's nonverbals that are kind of part of listening well, right? And we talked about a lot of this: maintaining eye contact if it's culturally appropriate, naturally changing our facial expression in response to what people are saying. They tell us something that they mean to be surprising, look surprised, right? Like it's I don't know, it's not a performance. We're tapping into something genuine, but we have to like convey that we're with people, right? So smiling, head nodding, gestures, these are all appropriate. And not doing other stuff, not looking at our phone when I'm supposed to be talking to you, right? And we talked about the note-taking thing. There's ways that we can take notes with people, but being careful not to be too caught up in doing a second task, right? And then Shauna adds, having an open posture. Yeah. And mirroring. So mirroring is, Hannah's going to guide us through mirroring a little bit in the reflection part of OARS here, right? So OARS is one of our key strategies for listening, and mirroring is sort of like part of that.
Yeah, OARS is a really simple acronym to remember ways to engage folks that give them the opportunity to direct the conversation. The O stands for open-ended questions as opposed to yes or no. So for example, that could look like, tell me what it's been like for you to be on the street in the past year, or what's your day like? What's it like for you to deal with, having to get well every morning? instead of saying something like, oh, it's got to be rough to, wake up sick every day or whatever that might be. That lets them really direct, and you might get answers you might not expect. Affirmations, we've talked about this earlier, gave you a little preview, but noticing what's going well for them and affirming that. Our R is reflective listening, like Ryan mentioned, making guesses about what's going on, repeating back what they say until you know you got it right. Putting yourself in their frame of mind. And then summarizing. This is one we haven't touched on too much. But summarizing when you've been listening, when you've had an engagement, kind of gathering up all the things you've talked about and putting it together to make sure that you're taking away what the person wants the takeaway from that conversation to be. When I'm engaging somebody on the street, this could look like, you've mentioned that you really like being on the street and this spot. You've been here for a long time. You've survived, which is, amazing. You know all the resources. At the same time, you've had your things stolen a few times, and you were in the hospital recently when it was really cold. So I'm wondering, if we could talk more about what you're thinking about housing next time. I can check in with you. If they say, no, I don't want to talk about this at all, listening to that. But summarizing the conversation checks in to make sure you're hearing them, and it also kind of helps clarify where they're at in the change process and what's important to them. So this is a good acronym for listening when we're having these change-oriented conversations. I'm looking at the time. Ryan, I can run through this real quick.
Yeah, let's go through the power of small talk, and then I think we'll maybe skip ahead a little bit. Thanks.
Cool. Small talk is another really practical tool we can have. And I'm guessing some of you are wondering why this is here. And that might mean you're really good at small talk. Congratulations. This is something I had to learn in my role as a case manager. It's easy to get in the routine of focusing on goals, our list of what we need to get done that day. But small talk can show people we really care about them as a person. And it can be hard. You might have varying levels of life experience. You might have grown up on the same block, or you just moved to the city and you don't know anything about their life. Both of those things can make it hard or easy. You can over-identify with folks, but finding common ground that's more neutral, asking them about their hobbies. We got a tip in a training recently to ask if they ever played an instrument. That person found that was a really helpful way to get people talking about their childhood or what they enjoy, music. And Philly, sports is always a great topic. I know nothing about sports, but I try to know enough that I can talk with folks about how the Eagles did last night. Talking with people about food, holidays. Some of these things connect to hard experiences for people, and that's okay too. Also, if it doesn't go anywhere, if you're awkward, that's okay. We talked about being real is more important than being perfect. Showing clients that you're a person too, and you don't always know what to say, can build some rapport as well. And I also wanted to talk about in that trust building and being aware of the historically marginalized identities folks are bringing, people are going to float little pieces of information out to see how you respond, especially if they are experiencing something that they've been judged for in the past. So noticing those things and responding without judgment can be so important. I had a client who was kind of exploring their gender presentation and would, wear nail polish or show up with or show me like, oh, this dress I found on the street. Look at that. What do you think? I was able to clue in like, oh, okay, this person is testing how I feel about this. And for me to say like, I love your nails. It looks great. Or that dress would look so cute on you. Even that wasn't how they were presenting typically at that time, really opened up a lot of doors for trust. So being aware of that as well as we're doing, that can come up in really small ways as we're engaging with small talk.
Awesome. Let me dive us ahead.
Yeah.
We did have another case that was a good example of small talk. And I think the point that I'll make just in brief there is that sometimes people's small talk is a way to kind of protect themselves from going deeper, but continuing to engage in that process can still be kind of a crucial thing that we can do. We talked a little bit about providing material benefits for people. And so kind of here's a formula that's not like all inclusive. I think I'll just say that like assertive engagement requires a high level of creativity. And we can do this in partnership with our teams. But the thinking is, hey, this person identified in our small talk that they love hot chocolate. Let's go get hot chocolate together. Do they like to engage in sports? We can do sports with them in our roles, right? Are they wanting to date? Can we help them figure out what it would take to like go clothes shopping or like get themselves in the kind of presentation that they want to have on a date, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think the point is here that we can tap into the small talk to provide some material benefit and some way of going slow to go fast. I think when you look at this list of stuff, it can seem like, oh, but that's not the real work of changing their relationship to drugs or to being street homelessness. And I want to say that, yes, it is, right? Engaging in these things is the pathway to relationship and ultimately engagement with folks, right? So do they like to do art? Let me bring some materials to do art. And eventually, and probably sooner than you think, that engagement is going to come. I do see one comment in the chat. Some choices are restricted in our center, and that's true for every facility, right? Every center. And so within the limitations that you have, I want to say that creativity is still really crucial. Okay, let me stop us there. We've been talking at you guys for so long now. And you've been so thoughtful and engaged in the chat. I appreciate that. We did have some more cases, but I think you'll be able to like kind of look at what these say when we send out the materials. I just want to stop us here and say, let me drop the course evaluation. We're done with content for today. I'm able to stick around for a few minutes if people have questions or comments, but I recognize that some folks may need to leave because we're kind of over time here. So thank you so much for joining us today in this discussion. Thanks for sharing your insights. Thanks for being with us. It was great talking with you.
Yeah, I love learning a little bit more about the work y'all are doing and what's been working for you and what challenges you have. I always learn something new from these trainings, so it's nice to be with y'all today.
Since a lot of chat has come in, I'm going to go ahead and drop the course eval link again. There you go. Grab that. And we'll be following up with an email to all the folks who registered with the materials, the slides, and the course eval link again. So thanks again, folks.